Hey, how's it going? I don't know why I said hey, but yeah, so what I'm gonna do for this study session slash review video is kind of just go over my essay that I wrote for Victors and Vanquished, and so you guys can see really how you can just incorporate different sources and have a flow and sort of communication between those sources. I'm not going into like the nitty-gritty of like how to write an essay because I think in the first study session that I did around the essays, I kind of covered that already. So this one is mainly just how do you uphold a conversation between multiple sources. Um, and I think really what you want to do to start off is establish the perspective in which you want to start off with and like which one you really want to focus on. So what I want to first highlight is how you can see when I'm introducing like this whole paragraph right here is my introduction. So when I'm introducing, you can see like I'm saying from both perspectives, right? I'm saying from the Spanish and Nahuas, right? They tried to understand each other's culture in which they were unfamiliar with, but finding ways that were familiar to them. And then I include this quote from sort of Montezuma and how he was sending out people to greet, and how he thought the Spanish were gods, right? Because again, he's trying to grasp this idea of who these people were because he had no idea who they were. And as I introduce this notion of like familiarity and trying to get that grasp, I then go into sort of what I'm arguing, right? I'm arguing, well, I'm going to be looking at how both societies understood hierarchies in clothing, right? And it's kind of right here. So I would say like that's kind of my main talking point thesis kind of, right? Though it's not really like in a thesis format, but it's what I'm going to be arguing. And again, I include that perspective. So I'm saying both. So what I'm highlighting is that it's not just one or the other, they're both doing the same thing. And I think that's very important too, because if you want to have one perspective, if you want to just have the Nahuatl perspective, or you just want to have the Spanish perspective, you can do that with this. But you need to make sure you counter it with the other perspective and how it can differentiate between the two. But if you're trying to fuse them together, I'm going to show you the ways in which I did it. So again, if we're talking about clothing, I kind of want to focus on this next line too, right? Um, where I said Nahuas have this understanding of godly figures being dressed in luxury jewels and cotton, and the Spanish had the same understanding for their own elites. What I'm doing is kind of backing up my thesis, so to say, and also I'm structuring how I'm going to be writing my paragraphs. So what I'm saying is like I'm going to look at it from the Nahua perspective on clothing, then I'm going to look at it at the Spanish perspective on clothing. And then taking it down, as we can see to this paragraph right here that I highlighted, what I begin to do is like, introduce the paragraph, all right, is going back to that earlier quote where I was like, oh, Montezuma sent out men to greet Cortez. And then these men carry precious items, and then highlighted from the like quote that I used what the precious items were. And I was saying like sort of this was their culture, and they knew if their Spanish were gods, they had to outfit them with luxury items. So that's why Montezuma sent the messengers with luxury items so they could get a better understanding to make sure the Spanish were gods. Of course, they soon realized the Spanish weren't gods, but they were trying to find that initial understanding of who these people were. And again, as you can see, like in my next point, I'm saying, though unsure, the Spanish were gods or not, but they saw like the iron being used as clothing, which was something that was unique because usually to Nahuas, iron was only something used as a weapon. So now seeing as um, clothing and things like that is completely different. And so now they're understanding the power behind really the clothing that was going on and realizing, whoa, the Spanish are more powerful than we realized because look at how they are dressing. And it's completely different from us. But now we're getting a better understanding because we can see how that hierarchy of clothing is working a little bit. So this this first couple paragraphs, I'm really focusing on this Nahuatl perspective, right? And then what I do is then I include, and I would recommend this too, if there's pictures in there you guys want to use as well, go ahead, put them in. I think I took a picture of it and then sent it, like airdropped it to my laptop and placed it on this and like cropped what I wanted. And then when you're referring to the illustration, you'd be like, oh, and this part of the book of Victors and Vanquished, this illustration, right? And for me, I'm using this illustration to highlight the Spanish perspective because you can barely see in it, but there's a lot of like peasants coming in, a lot of conquistadors, right? You see Cortez, maybe I say this is Malazine. I argue that point a little bit later, right? So I'm sort of like depicting what this picture means. And I'm introducing it, but then as I'm introducing it, I'm also backing it up with, as you can see right here, I'm backing it up with a quote from Victors and Vanquished as well, right? So it's like, though it's taken from there, I'm also backing it up with another thing to highlight my point. And what I'm saying is that what so what am I saying? Oh, so I'm arguing that this is sort of like the first encounter, right, between the Nahuas and the Spanish. And then as Cortez is describing their clothing, he's making a reference to Moorish robes, right? So like a Muslim culture. Because again, to the Spanish, that was what they understood and could make references to. So I'm highlighting how the Nahuas referenced gods with luxury items to understand power. The Spanish are trying to understand what these people are by looking at their clothing and making references to like the Moorish robes and Muslim clothing and things like that. Um, yeah, really trying to understand each other's cultures. And I brought in the two perspectives. And now I've showed the illustration, right, of the first meeting, how it can be, added the quote to back it up. So really, it's like a ping pong thing, right? So you say one thing, then you bring in the other, you bring in the next, you bring in the next. And then I talk about this, and this paragraph talks about Malazine. Malazine, where I essentially say like she can, since she was from that area, can be seen like depicted in the robe and the right here, and that's probably to be like understanding of the Nahuatl culture and try to be friendly to like be a bridge between the two societies. And clothing was a way she could do that, right, by wearing traditional Nahuatl cotton and things like that. But yeah, really, what you guys, I'm gonna keep like reiterating this point is when you have one perspective, back it up with another, and then kind of go back and forth. If you're trying to argue for both, if you're trying to argue for one, so say if I was only focused on the Nawal perspective from this, right? What I would do is sort of have each source that like can back it up. But then say like I was talking, if I was still doing this idea of clothing, I could then be like, well, a counter to that would be how Spanish, perceived clothing too. So you can see like there's similarities between how they perceive. And then that could be like, oh, hey, here's how I'm also using these other sources from the book as well. And I'm not mainly drowning it out with just one specific source. So if you want to do that, you can do that. But what I would recommend is you kind of have this approach of you're going in with both perspectives and you're going to just bounce back and forth and you're going to go in a ping pong type of way. I think that really can be useful and it makes the paper go by easier because you bring in one point, now you got to bring another, and then you have that communication between the different points, and then you kind of sum it up at the end, talking about like the big idea of like how, for me, it was like really how Montezuma and Cortez and the Spanish and Nahua understood each other by understanding the hierarchies that they had in their own society. And they did that through looking at the clothing because they understood that clothing was something that was valued by the elites. And you saw a peasant with rags, oh, they're at the lower social class. But you see a dude walking around in iron armor, oh, he gotta have wealth. You see a dude with luxury items and jewels all over his body, oh, he's gotta have wealth. You see somebody with just cotton rags around, the private parts in areas like that, oh, they're bottom of the class, right? So they understood those basics of society and how similar their societies were, and how it could also like make that fusion for both societies to happen because they understood the basics. They understood, oh, they know how to act like us a little bit because we can see this through clothing. And then, just going back and forth, highlighting, oh, this is how the novels did. Oh, this is how the Spanish thought. Oh, this is how the novels, right? So I'm not saying do clothing for yours, but I'm saying make sure you bring in, especially with Victors and Vanquished, there's a lot of sources from both sides. Bring in both sides. And if you want to, like I said, if you want to highlight one side, highlight that one side, but make sure you have some counter arguments into it. This is very quick. I think it might only be like 10 minutes. I'm not sure, but I'm gonna also post this onto the announcement I have. Really, I just wanted to give you guys a source for like how you guys can look at that ping pong effect I was talking about. And since I'm not talking about like the writing style and like getting in the nitty-gritty of like paragraphs and things like that, I kind of realized like this was gonna be a fairly short video, but hope this helps a little bit. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And like I said, this essay you guys can look over and we'll have access to.